Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Sunday, everybody. We normally don't do a video on a Sunday, but this is a special extra for this week, and it is special for another reason too. Today's video is episode 1000 of China Update. I am deeply fortunate to be able to do something I love with this channel, and it's a tremendous privilege and pleasure that I am able to share these updates with you all every day. From day one, I set out to try to better understand China through grounded and sober analysis, and hopefully contribute, however modestly, to the world having better informed conversations about China. My commitment to these ends, now like then, remains the same. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along on this journey with me, some from episode 1 all the way through now to episode 1000. I hope we will continue to grow together for the next 1000 videos and beyond. Thank you. Now, let's get on with today's episode. In yesterday's video, we briefly examined a speech last month by Zheng Yongnian, in which he discussed the importance of Southeast Asia for China, couched within a broader examination of China's wider geopolitical situation and foreign policy objectives. Zheng is a political scientist who spent most of his career abroad and has now become one of China's most prominent public intellectuals. Some have even called him a Chinese Peter Zeihan, able to discuss various geopolitical theatres and regions, but from Beijing's perspective. His speech provides an excellent look at how nationalist Chinese intellectuals are debating Chinese strategic thinking and how elites in Beijing view the world. We don't need to agree with his views. Indeed, I'm sure some of them, some viewers will very much disagree with, but it's critical that we understand them, whether our end is cooperation with China or, more saliently, competition. It's important that we understand these worldviews. In yesterday's video, I asked if viewers wanted a further exploration of Zheng's speech in a future video. The response was an overwhelming yes. So for today, a special Sunday episode and China Update's 1000th episode, we will examine this speech from Zheng. The folks at the Substack Sinification published an excellent translation of the speech. We will quote from this translation. They do a lot of great work, and I would recommend checking them out. Now, we remind ourselves that Zheng is a Chinese nationalist intellectual, so his language and worldview reflects this. But I would argue that it is quite representative of elite views and highly influential in Beijing. This is exactly why we are examining it here. We'll also see that Zheng will make scathing criticisms of other countries while conspicuously failing to acknowledge that similar criticisms could be made of China. This is partly because of the restricted discourse environment in China, partly due to political correctness, and, frankly, partly just down to ideological blind spots one often has towards one's own system. Now, just quickly, if you get some value from today's episode, don't forget to like, and if you'd like to see the channel grow, liking, sharing, and subscribing is a big help too. Now, with all that said, and without any further ado, we will quote Zheng's speech in translation directly, with some light editing for the sake of brevity. 1. Introduction. Today, I would like to explore the broader context of China's ASEAN relations and China's periphery diplomacy, which includes our relations with Japan and South Korea, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Russia, the Middle East, South Asia, and so on. After all, in today's world, it is increasingly difficult for China to separate its diplomacy in one region from another. As a quick aside, as we explored yesterday, several American commentators, from Harvard University's Joseph Nye to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, made the same point at a security conference on Friday. We return to Zheng's speech. I remember Napoleon once said, "China is a sleeping lion of the East. When she wakes, she will shake the world." After China fell asleep, its entire modern history became a history of humiliation. Defeated in the 2 Opium Wars, then defeated by its former student Japan, and after more than a century of war and revolution, from 1840 to 1949, the Chinese people finally stood up. Since its reform and opening up period, China has achieved a remarkable rise after awakening. Now we must realize that China has become one of the focal points in global geopolitics. The next question to consider is, when asleep we were bullied. Now that we have awoken and risen, How are others attempting to encircle, contain, or even throttle us? From this perspective, China-ASEAN relations are particularly important. The current relationship between China and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations countries, is strongly impacted by the broader international context. In this regard, I think it can be viewed from three levels. 2. The rise of populism and nationalism. First, at the micro level, populist and nationalist forces are rising across the world. The domestic and foreign affairs of sovereign states are inseparable. As the Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz once said, "Diplomacy is the continuation of domestic politics, and war is another manifestation of politics." What are the domestic politics of countries like in today's world? As evidenced by the recent European Parliament elections, whether it is in the US, Europe, or even Latin America, whether in the West, East, North, or South, and regardless of the country or region's level of development and political system, the whole world is facing a rise in populism and nationalism. Although this pertains to the domestic level, international relations scholars must never forget the lessons that have repeatedly emerged throughout history. Nationalism and populism are two sides of the same coin. Once the forces of populism and nationalism are unleashed, they will have a long-term impact on the international political landscape. Populism and nationalism are linked to the development of one's domestic economy and society. It takes a long time to resolve and stabilize such a political situation. We can take a look back at how, before World War I and World War II, populism led to the two world wars. We can also look further back at the rise of socialist movements in Europe after the 1848 revolutions. It should be noted that the populism mentioned here is not just a right-wing stance. Positions taken by the left wing can also manifest themselves as populism. Clashes between right-wing and left-wing extremism within individual countries can easily show up in international politics. 3. No one likes war, but war eventually happens. Second, at the national meso level, populist forces have begun to compete for power. From the recent EU parliamentary elections, one can see that the rise of extremism and the far right is an inevitable trend. If Trump comes to power again, it is highly likely that the US will form a quasi-fascist regime. Trump mentioned in one of his speeches that he intends to lock up his political enemies and those he dislikes. Such statements are manifestations of populist and quasi-fascist statements. For China, if political forces like those of Mike Pompeo and Steve Bannon, who are extremely hostile to China and the Communist Party of China, come to power, the United States will probably adopt a fascist foreign policy towards China. In particular, a Trump administration would have an impact on European politics, leading to the emergence of more quasi-fascist regimes in Europe, similar to the rise of fascist regimes in many European countries before World War II. Of course, if Biden can remain in power, it will have a certain restraining effect on extremist groups. However, we must also be clear-eyed that his China policy will see no significant softening. Mr. Henry Kissinger once said, "No one likes war, but war eventually happens." Everyone wants to solve domestic and international problems using other means, but when they can't, they resort to violence. The logic behind international wars and domestic violence is the same. Domestically, when many issues cannot be resolved, we resort to violence. Internationally, weaker nations will resort to violence to resist stronger nations. Similarly, if major powers cannot resolve problems with smaller countries or with other major powers, they too will resort to violence. 4. One world, two systems. Third, at the macro level, the bipolarization of geopolitics has become a major trend. This bipolarization is evident not only in the economic realm, but also in the political and geopolitical realms. Politically, Biden refers to Sino-US competition as American democracy versus Chinese ideology. Economically, the international trade system centered around the WTO has stopped working and has been supplanted by various US-led trade groupings. We have said all along that the United States is engaging in deglobalization, but in reality, it is actually in the process of reconstructing international trade organizations around itself. Recently, the West has been promoting another narrative, namely that China is creating a China-centered international trading system by means of its Belt and Road Initiative. Is the global trading system really becoming akin to a world split into two separate systems, as some people say? Although this remains an open question, the speed of decoupling between China on the one side and the US and Europe on the other is accelerating. We must be careful. Geopolitically, the United States has put significant effort into reshaping its geopolitical strategy, establishing a number of exclusive alliance networks in China's neighborhood. This is another manifestation of this one world, two systems. From the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to AUKUS, the US is trying to de-risk its supply chains, artificial intelligence, information, and military technology away from China. Micro, meso, and macro-level forces are reinforcing each other, accelerating the reshaping of the current world order. 5. The West's cognitive warfare against China. In this context, the relationship between China and ASEAN countries has profound significance. Recent trends indicate that ASEAN countries' perception of China has improved considerably when compared with their view of the United States. This is essentially the result of the interplay of the above three factors. In the same way, these three levels are also influencing the relationship between China and ASEAN in a negative way. In particular, the recently concluded Shangri-La dialogue has many new and noteworthy aspects compared with previous years. According to relevant reports, at the 21st Shangri-La dialogue, US allies such as the Philippines, Australia, and Canada hyped the China threat narrative on issues such as those related to the South China Sea and freedom of navigation. First, both the US and Europe are shifting their strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific region. The US has been shifting its strategic focus to East Asia and the Asia-Pacific region since the Obama era. In recent years, it has been reconstructing the geopolitics and economic framework of the Indo-Pacific region in order to achieve this strategic goal. Surprisingly, Europe's geopolitical focus has also shifted to the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific regions. The Shangri-La dialogue, initially a forum for Asia-Pacific security, has now almost become a platform for transatlantic security concerns. From Biden's recent media interviews, it can be seen that the US has a very clear understanding of the progress of the Russia-Ukraine war, including the daily number of shells used and the number of soldiers lost. Why hasn't Russia failed as quickly as the West predicted? The US and Europe are now waging a cognitive war, effectively bundling China and Russia together. Although this bundling has existed since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the West is now starting to attribute its failure to defeat Russia to China. Senior US officials have been shaping the narrative that it is because China exports dual-use goods to Russia that the Russo-Ukrainian war can continue. Despite the US and Europe themselves trading energy and other commodities with Russia, China is seen as the most important support for Russia in its war of attrition. We cannot underestimate this cognitive warfare. In Europe, whether in the media, diplomatic circles, or strategic circles, all complaints and hatred are being vented on China in the belief that China is the root cause of Russia's ability to fight a protracted war. This not only affects China's relationship with the West, but also impacts its relations with Asian countries. I believe, from any angle, Southeast Asia is the most valuable diplomatic area for China to focus on for a long time to come. 6. Japan and South Korea. No hope in sight. Let's look at Northeast Asia. Japan and South Korea have already become completely passive, lying flat, because their national security systems form a part of the US's own security system. They have already decided to continue following the US diplomatically. 7. China-Russia ties. We currently have a good relationship with Russia. However, both countries have their respective strategic considerations. We must pay close attention to the state of the conflict in Ukraine and monitor any changes in Russian policies. If Russia adjusts its stance and China has not adjusted its own in time, we will find ourselves in a very passive position. I noticed that on the day the West commemorated the Normandy landing, Putin held several hours of meetings. From the wording, it seems that Putin hopes to adjust the course of the war. In any case, Russia remains a part of the West. Ever since the Tsarist era, Russia's only goal has been to become a Western country. In fact, the relationship between Russia and the West is not as antagonistic as we perceive it to be. When the West rejects Russia, Russia opposes the West. When the West accepts it, Russia couldn't be happier. According to Russia's Sputnik news agency, President Putin has stated that Russia is willing to continue negotiations with Ukraine on condition that the current state of the battlefield is preserved. We must pay close attention to the adjustment of Russia's attitude towards the West in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. Particularly, once the United States has identified China as its only competitor, the US will reconsider its stance towards Russia. For the United States and other Western countries, the goal of their diplomacy towards Russia will be to ensure that Russia no longer causes trouble. In the end, once Putin has achieved some of his goals and the West has achieved some of theirs, they will probably be able to start compromising. If we do not clearly understand this and continue with our own previous policies, we will find ourselves in a very passive, another translation could be vulnerable, position. 8. China and Central Asia. Security first. In our relations with Central Asia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization plays an important role. However, interactions between China and these countries within the SCO is more focused on security. Although consideration for economic issues is present, it takes a back seat. Throughout China's millennia-long history, it has been difficult to achieve a major shift towards development in our diplomatic policy towards our northwestern periphery. We must also note that Turkey's rise will put a lot of pressure on our northwestern frontier. 9. The India problem. If we now look towards South Asia, India has huge ambitions. We must pay close attention to the development of China-India relations. In the modern era, the nation-state, known as India, did not come into being through its own efforts. It was bestowed by the British. At the founding of India, the parties led by Gandhi, Nehru, and others were family-based parties. Now Modi's BJP party has developed from a regional party into a national party. We must not underestimate him. Ideologically, the Indian nationalism espoused by Modi is a combination of Hindu nationalism and anti-China nationalism. Since Hindu nationalism poses significant risks domestically, Modi frequently resorts to anti-China nationalism to strengthen his governing legitimacy. Modi is still strengthening his Hindu nationalist agenda, which, while attracting a large number of voters, also sows the seeds of potential religious conflict. At the same time, the situation in India also reflects that the transformation of political parties in late developing countries is also centered on the nation-state. I believe the pressure that India exerts on China does not stem from its role in the US's Indo-Pacific strategy, but rather from India's own systemic transformation and subsequent rise. With China and India as two major neighboring countries, China remains defensive and finds it difficult to expand diplomatically within India's sphere of influence. 10. On the importance of China-ASEAN relations. Therefore, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is extremely important to China. For China to become a maritime power, it cannot afford to lose ASEAN. For China to continue advancing its economic development and modernization, it cannot afford to lose ASEAN. And for China to ensure its geopolitical security, it cannot afford to lose ASEAN either. Overall, our policy towards ASEAN in recent years has been relatively successful. When Pompeo visited Southeast Asia, he tried to rally Southeast Asian countries to follow the United States. However, ASEAN made a collective decision not to take sides between China and the US. On one hand, ASEAN has maintained its security relationship with the US, while on the other it has developed its economic ties with China. This is very beneficial for China. China itself has adopted the right diplomatic policy towards these countries. When the US was forcing ASEAN to choose sides, China adopted and advocated open and inclusive multilateralism, thereby providing a premise for ASEAN countries to maintain their neutrality. Looking at this year's Shangri-La dialogue, what kind of pressure will ASEAN face once the United States and Europe shift their strategic focus from India to Southeast Asia? How should we view China-ASEAN relations from ASEAN's perspective? How should the South China Sea issue be resolved? Should we continue with our previous approach, or should we adopt a different way of thinking? Recently, we have been looking into the construction of a China-ASEAN common market and found that in the context of our current trade wars with the United States and Europe, the 0.3 version of the China-ASEAN FTA mechanism is still insufficient to unleash the full vitality of China-ASEAN bilateral economic relations. What should our research community do? I believe that our research on ASEAN is far from sufficient. Area studies have now become a first-level discipline in China, but the focus of area studies needs to go beyond language. It is difficult to study ASEAN merely through languages. We must focus more on studying ASEAN through the lens of social sciences. Another factor in our relationship with these countries is the Chinese diaspora. The vast majority of overseas Chinese reside in these countries. However, they can constitute both a bridge for our diplomatic outreach and a pitfall leading to diplomatic mistakes. The relationship between the Chinese diaspora and their motherland is very complex and cannot be explained in a few words. It should be considered from a more intricate perspective. We should not assume that just because there are Chinese people in Southeast Asia, diplomacy can be advanced just as we envision it. I hope that our new generation of researchers will approach the study of China and Southeast Asia from the perspective of global politics. Simply looking at China-ASEAN relations solely from the viewpoint of China-ASEAN relations no longer allows us to understand the essence of the problem. In order to understand the economic and political realities of Southeast Asia better, we need to view the relationship between China and ASEAN from all aspects, such as global geopolitics, the reshaping of the world's economic system, and ideological competition. This will also help us formulate more effective foreign policies. Here ends the direct quote of Zheng's speech and today's special Sunday episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you for video 1001 tomorrow.